Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Heather McClanahan. I'm the Executive Director of the Los Alamos Historical Society, and welcoming you to the first of our 2019 lectures. Tonight, we have a very special presentation. Now, many of you have heard me tell this story before. As we prepared nearly 3 years ago to redo the museum exhibits, we were excited about the possibility of the first time of really delving into the Cold War story. And we said, let's look into the scholarship, because we all know that if 1,000 books have been written about the Manhattan Project, 998 of them talk about Los Alamos. So we said, well, there's at least 1,000 books on the Cold War, let's go start looking at the scholarship. 2 of them talk about Los Alamos. And we realized that if we wanted to give the depth and the breadth to the Cold War story that we've been able to give to the Ranch School story and to the Manhattan Project story, we were going to have to do our own research. So at the Historical Society's fundraising gala in 2017, our generous members and friends chipped in more than $6,000 for research. And we were pleased to hire Samuel Buelow to do that research. Samuel has spent many months looking through the archives and old newspapers and magazines, listening to oral history interviews, and answering the questions of how did Los Alamos grow and change during the Cold War years. Tonight's talk comes from that research, and it will serve as the basis of the forthcoming exhibit in the rotating gallery and new exhibits in the Hans Beta House, Harold Agnew Cold War Gallery. So why Samuel? Well, Samuel is a Los Alamos native who grew up here in the 1980s. He has his PhD in anthropology from Indiana University, studying LGBT issues in Central Asia. He's extensively studied in Kazakhstan and the location of the Soviet nuclear test site. And he says he's not fluent. He says he only speaks and understands Kazakh and Russian. And probably just as important as all of this, Samuel was hired 2 years ago as our first weekend docent at the Hans Beta House. And he had the opportunity to interact there with visitors and to understand what it is they want to know about Los Alamos in the Cold War. So that has helped clarify and define his research topics. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Samuel Buelow.
Before I really get into the project itself, there are a couple of people I want to thank because they have done most of the legwork for this project. So Callie Funk was the intern this summer who did the archival research. Christopher Killian and Jacob Erickson did some oral histories a few years ago, and I've been working with their recordings. And so I noticed some faces in the audience tonight who I've seen on those recordings, but who I haven't had a chance to meet myself, and then a lot of other familiar faces here tonight as well. So I hope this goes well, right? You know where to find me if it doesn't. Okay, so let's see. So my main job right now has been to analyze the data that other researchers have collected and to put that in dialogue with both published and unpublished data on the Cold War and Los Alamos itself. So as Heather mentioned, sort of the primary goals that are coming out of this project are to design a small exhibit for the Historical Museum's rotating gallery in the guest cottage, to influence a reworking of exhibits in the Hans Beta House and the Harold Agnew Cold War Gallery. And this project combines archival research and oral histories to craft a narrative of community development in Los Alamos during the Cold War and examines the everyday experiences of Los Alamos residents during the Cold War to better understand both the transformation of the community and its role in greater geopolitics. This project seeks to tell a story of Los Alamos that decenters the laboratory. And while because of the symbiotic relationship of the lab and the town, it is impossible to tell the story of the town without reference to the lab, this does not mean that the lab must dominate every story about Los Alamos. It is our goal to seek out a variety of perspectives that paint a varied picture of how Los Alamos developed and what it meant to its different inhabitants and neighbors. I appreciate the input of community members, and at the end of the talk, note cards, right? So the way that we sort of conducted this research came up with this list of sort of generic topics that we were interested in. And I presented these categories to Callie Funk this summer, and She has provided cursory notes, on a number of these topics. While this list structured the research process, many stories cover multiple categories, and thus the lecture will not be structured along these lines. So I'm not going to go leisure, religion, education, right? But we're going to look at things a little bit more holistically. Research in history and anthropology is often a bit like a scavenger hunt, where one source seldom gives you all the information, but provides clues to new information that then must be tracked down before you can get a complete picture. For instance, I was listening to an interview the other day that was talking about the golf course in Los Alamos, and that we had a golf course fairly early on, and that it was located somewhere in the northern part of town, but that it had moved, and there was now a park there, and I was like, is that urban park? And so I started kind of trying to track this down. And according to the golf course's website, it was built in 1947, and is the second oldest 18-hole course in New Mexico. It seems to have not changed locations, but I could be wrong about that. So this is kind of that process of checking source against source. So sometimes recollections are accurate, sometimes they're not. But with oral history, the recollection is as important as the actual event itself, and offers new understandings not only of what happened in the past, but how we carry the past with us as we move into the future. So, as a researcher, I'm very interested in not just what happened, but how people narrate what happened, right? I am a cultural anthropologist by training, and therefore I traffic in narratives. At the heart of cultural anthropology is the practice of storytelling. We collect data by listening to stories and by living through stories alongside the people we are studying. We write up and disseminate data by telling and retelling stories. Excuse me, congested here 1 second. I always think of my data through an interconnected web of narratives, anecdotes, and stories. And this lecture tonight will reflect this training and follow these patterns. So I'm not going to stand up here and give you kind of a list of dates or important events that happened in Los Alamos, but rather try to connect a series of narratives that I've uncovered through this process and relate those stories. You may recognize some of these stories. Some of these may be your own stories. Some of them may be the stories of your neighbors or your friends. And I hope I do them justice. So certain narrative threads have connected stories throughout Los Alamos' history, while other things change or cycle as time passes. For instance, safety is a very prevalent narrative that I saw in many of the accounts ranging from the 1950s to the present day. So certain key features in this are things like people leave their homes unlocked, and children play unsupervised in the canyons where mountain lions and rattlesnakes are still thought of as more of a risk than neighbors, although some acknowledge that the reverse is almost undoubtedly true. As this last point illustrates, intertwined with that is the complex relationship with nature, another common thread in narratives throughout Los Alamos history. Children and adults both play in places like Acid Canyon and Morton Canyon without thought as to why these places bear these names. So I was working in the beta house one day, right, and someone got into this conversation with a couple of people who were from Los Alamos and a couple of people who were from other places, and we were like, yeah, we used to go hiking in Acid Canyon all the time, and built forts in Morton Canyon, used to run around, and someone was like, it's called Morton Canyon, the name means death. How did you not know to not play there? And we're like, we just never thought about it, right? It was perfectly normal and naturalized. And this thread of the idea that there are things that are normal here that are not considered normal other places is something that would come up from time to time. So in one of the oral histories I was listening to, a woman who grew up here talks about going for walks with her uncle and stopping to listen to the bombs going off. And I was like, bombs going off? I don't think I ever heard bombs going off. And then a few months later, I was out by the New Mexico Consortium, the co-op, that area. And I think I was walking along the canyon rim trail there. And sure enough, I heard an explosion, and I was like, oh, bombs going off, yeah! So, as for children, in the interviews, I saw the repetition of the same mantra repeated throughout my childhood in the 80s and 90s. Los Alamos is a great place to raise kids. Although I've heard the truth of this statement debated extensively by people who grew up here. So in one of the interviews, the couple being interviewed moved away from Los Alamos in the mid-1950s. They did not intend to return since, as the wife put it, you don't go back. However, in the early 60s, the couple had 3 daughters, and the husband had job prospects in 3 cities, La Jolla, Palo Alto, and Los Alamos. By that time, we had 3, and the wife says, by that time we had 3 little girls, and I thought, you know, it's the 60s. I think Los Alamos might be the safer place to raise 3 girls, and it was a wonderful choice. So I was thinking about this idea of these sort of common narratives that keep coming through the story of Los Alamos, right? So we have this idea that this is a safe place. And a lot of that sort of surrounds the idea that this is an enclave community, or that we are off the beaten path, that we are isolated, right? And so this idea of isolation is another thing that keeps coming up, as is the theme of secrecy, right? So in another interview, one of the women was discussing dinner parties, and she said that back in the day, all of the men would gather in one room and all of the women in another, because the men wanted to talk shop, and this was, one of the few instances outside of actually being at the lab where they could talk about their work, right? And she said that because her husband could not talk about her work, so she says, quote, "You didn't say how your day was. They could ask they could ask us how ours was, but we never even asked. I never asked." And she goes on to talk about how at her husband's funeral, she asked those in attendance to write a memory of her husband. When she read the stories about him from his colleagues, she learned about all these things in his life, in his work life, that she never knew had happened. And she said that even after a lot of these events had become declassified, her husband had never talked about them. That was how ingrained this secrecy was, right? So I wanted to pair this with this quote up on the screen, and I'm not quite sure how clear the text is in the back, so I will read this to you. Science is a collective enterprise, and the scientists on the Manhattan Project were anything but isolated. They were part of one of the largest, most complex, and most collaborative endeavors in the history of science. And this is a quote from David Hecht, who's a professor at Bowdoin College, who wrote the book Storytelling in Science, Rewriting Oppenheimer in the Nuclear Age. And this quote really resonated with me when I was reading this book. Because this narrative of the secrecy and the silence and the isolation is so strong, that to think about the way in which Los Alamos was very much connected to the greater world, not only to northern New Mexico, but to Washington, D.C., and to places all over the world, right? And continues to be so. And so this is another theme that you're going to see in some of the stories as we move through here. So, okay. So let's ground things back again at the Hans Beta house for a minute here, which is where my journey into this formally begins. And we get a lot of different visitors at the Beta house. We get people from town, we get people from out of town, people who are just visiting Santa Fe and they saw a brochure and they were like, hey, Los Alamos sounds like a cool thing to do, let's go up there for a day. You get people who make pilgrimages here, right? So I met a man once who had seen a play about, and now I can't remember which of the Manhattan Project physicists it was, but he'd seen this play about this guy and he was like, I have to go to Los Alamos. And so he traveled from the East Coast all the way out to Los Alamos just because of this play that he had watched, right? But one of the things that keeps coming up again and again amongst people who, obviously not people who are from here, but people from outside of town, is the realization that Los Alamos is actually a town. And people are often quite shocked to find out that people live here, that there are businesses, that there are restaurants, that there are schools, and that there is an entire community that is Los Alamos. This idea is not new. People have been shocked by this since at least 1954, when this report was written. So this is from a report called Notes on Los Alamos. It was written in 1954. The author is unknown. But he says, first-time visitors to Los Alamos often come with a preconceived notion that they will find something awesome and abnormal about the Los Alamos community. They leave, however, with the feeling of having visited an interesting but perfectly normal American community, whose population of 13,000 come from each of the 48 states and many different countries. If transplanted to suburban Chicago, New York, or Philadelphia, Los Alamos would equal its neighboring communities in civic spirit, community facilities, and activities. And we'll get into these issues of civic spirit, community facilities, and activity as this lecture goes on. So, what brought people here, right? I mean, we all know the story of the Manhattan Project, but people kept coming after that. And in these interviews were some wonderful, wonderful stories about what had brought people to Los Alamos. So there was one woman who talked about she was training to be a teacher and took a course that was taught by the superintendent of the Los Alamos school system. And it was a summer course, and while she was there, he handed her a contract and said, when you graduate, you come to Los Alamos. And then probably my favorite story is this one from a neighbor of mine, actually. She graduated college in 1946 with a degree in chemistry from Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. She wanted to get out of Ohio and away from home, and Los Alamos was very much in the news at the time, right? And she found this advertisement for this job in Los Alamos. So in Cleveland, she was working, she just got her degree in chemistry, had been winning awards in chemistry, and she was working in a research lab and also doing literature searches and translation. And she said that what she really enjoyed was the information part of the job. So the literature searches, the bibliographies, right? And she saw this ad for a job as a bibliographer at Los Alamos. And so she applies, she gets the job, she moves out to Los Alamos, she lives in a dorm with a bunch of other single women, she's having a great time. And then this goes on for a few years, and then she decides, I need to get a husband. And decides that Los Alamos is probably not the place to do it. As people have put it, the odds are good, but the goods are odd. So some of you are laughing a little too hard at that joke. So she decides to move to California to find a man, right? And while she's out there, she happens to meet this guy who was a World War II veteran, had been in the Navy, and had been stationed in the Philippines, where he had worked with a number of Los Alamos people on Operation Crossroads. So one of the early tests in the Pacific. The two married in Palo Alto in 1955, and ended up returning to Los Alamos. And she said that when she was here, she was at a party, and Bradbury said to her, "Oh, you're such a good recruiter." So it was really neat to see sort of these different circumstances by which people came to the town. And so another common theme that comes up is this idea of Los Alamos as a government town, right? And sometimes it's framed as a company town, sometimes as a government town. And it was really quite literally a government town in that the land was controlled by the federal government. We were not more or less part of the state of New Mexico. This created a number of problems for residents in terms of things like if you wanted to get a divorce, you couldn't legally do that in Los Alamos for a while. If you wanted to vote, you couldn't legally do that as a resident of Los Alamos, but it all depended on where you were. And so I'll hop to that in just a moment here. But I wanted to share with you this quote from an interview with John Hunter in 2006. "One thing that surprised me is that Los Alamos became more of a suburb of Washington, D.C. than of Santa Fe. It had a huge role in national policy, with scientists giving expertise to congressional committees and the president about what to do with atomic energy. People around the country looked to Los Alamos for guidance in what to do in an atomic age, or at least some assurance that everything was going to be okay. Anyone who saw the photos that came out of Hiroshima and Nagasaki said, 'This could happen where I live.'" And this was a quote, and I'd seen this a couple of places, that really struck me, this sort of idea that we're a suburb of DC rather than a suburb of Santa Fe, right? And that this again ties back into this idea of the government town, right? That we're tied to the government and to a project of national security in a very inextricable way. So back to the point I was making earlier, these maps, and it's a little hard to tell on the slide which parts are shaded and which parts are not shaded. But these are from The Battle for Civil Rights, or How Los Alamos Became a County by Marjorie Bell Chambers. And the shaded areas indicate lands over which the US government had exclusive jurisdiction. In the unshaded areas owned by the state, residents have more rights. This, the caption that she gives for this. And she talks about, for instance, these shaded areas actually cut through individual properties. So some people's houses, half the house is in the shaded area and half the house is in the unshaded area. And whether or not you had the rights of a resident of New Mexico depended on where your bedroom was. So there were all these jokes about people who slept on the sofa to get voting rights. There was also talk, apparently in the early days, there was a lot of resistance to Los Alamos residents voting in Sandoval County because it was a very Republican county at the time, and at the time Los Alamos tended to swing blue, and people were very upset about this impact on local politics, right? That this traditionally Republican county of Sandoval County was being overrun by all these Los Alamos Democrats. And this is another thing that the town has sort of moved in different directions over time, right? The red versus blue, and which way the county swings. So it's probably impossible to talk about Los Alamos, the community, without talking about the Zia Company, right? So the Zia Company controlled lab facilities from 1946 to 1986. They are still around. They not controlling Los Alamos anymore, but other national defense properties in New Mexico. And from 1946 to about 1966, they also controlled all of the private land in Los Alamos. So in the early days in Los Alamos, you couldn't own a house you had to rent it from the Zia company. And the Zia company controlled everything, all utilities, all maintenance, the bus service, the taxi service, the fire department, all of this was run by the Zia company. And apparently, if you wanted to mow your own lawn, you had to apply to get special dispensation from the Zia company to be allowed to mow your own lawn or keep up your own property. Although they would provide seeds free of charge to those who are interested in the government. So this idea of property ownership was something that came up again in both the interviews and the archival research. So in 1955, Ebony magazine did a feature on George L. Johnson, who was then the only African-American scientist working at the lab. Ebony magazine stresses the importance of the prohibition of owning private land. The government allocation of housing allows for more equitable treatment in regards to race, and the Johnsons live in a middle-class home comparable with white families. So the reason I chose these two pictures from the article, the one you can see with them outside the church reads, "Johnsons live quiet life in city called Planner's Dream." And I wanted to draw attention to that idea of this sort of Los Alamos being this kind of utopian space from the eyes of a civic planner, right? And then the other actually shows their residence. And I'll read you the headline with that, or sorry, the caption with that, because I thought it was really interesting. Welcoming Johnson home from a day at the laboratory is daughter Patricia Ann, 9, and wife Faith. Totally deaf but excellent lip reader, chemist was observed over a week by wartime draft officials before they would believe he was not faking condition. So to put that in a slightly more natural tone of voice, George Johnson was completely deaf. He'd lost his hearing due to meningitis in his early teens, but was an excellent lip reader. He was so proficient in lip reading that the government, or the draft officials, observed him for an entire week to make sure that he wasn't faking his disability. Right? So Ebony magazine cites the lack of private land ownership as an important factor in keeping Los Alamos housing egalitarian, an issue that came up in some of the interviews as well. However, the housing system was not seen by all as egalitarian, and houses were awarded based on a complex point system that factored in criticality of job, years of service, and size of family. So if you go to the Hans Beta House, there's this really nifty little exhibit where you take a card and it's got a family, and you have how many points the family has, then you have to match them up with the types of housing that were available at the time. And so if you have a lot of points, you might get a bathtub row house. If you have very few points, you might have a Quonset hut, right? And this did cause some resentment in the community, right? Especially if you were the person in the Quonset hut. So for some, this was seen as an equalizing force. For others, it was a bone of contention. And another theme that came up in the interviews was this idea that property ownership was an important milestone for people to be having in their early 30s, and that since you couldn't own property in Los Alamos, a lot of the residents, and the average age of residents in the 1950s was about 34, 36, was this idea that you couldn't partake in that portion of the American dream, right? So, one other point there was that that people talked about was that when people were allowed to own land in Los Alamos, that you did start to see a diversification of architecture along class lines, right? And so that we now have one of the interviewees described it as McMansions popping up around town, and that it used to be that you didn't know who the millionaires were because everybody lived in more or less the same sort of housing. And now that there's a lot more opportunity for conspicuous consumption in Los Alamos. So this all comes to this question that was another thing that was asked me 8 million times at the Beta House, and including by residents of Los Alamos. What do people do in Los Alamos? And some people mean this in the sense of what's going on at the lab, how is the community structured, and then other people are just like, so wait, the sidewalks roll up at 7 p.m. on a Friday night? But looking back into the interviews, Los Alamos wasn't necessarily always this way, right? That a lot of the people interviewed talked about a lot of really great leisure activities they'd have been involved with as young adults in Los Alamos. And so a lot of this centered around civic clubs and organizations, so things like the Choral Society, the Symphony, the Little Theater, Kiwanis, Rotary, these kinds of organizations, right? And so there was really a lot to do here. And this included, to a certain extent, for children as well. So, for instance, or maybe this number that I'm about to cite for you actually shows the reverse, I'm not sure. In the 1960s, 62% of Los Alamos boys were involved in Boy Scouts. But nationwide, only 12% of boys were involved in Scouting. And so I think that this is also a number that sort of reflects this relationship to nature that keeps coming up again and again in the interviews and in just sort of narratives that you hear around town in general, right? And you still see this today. Hiking, mountain biking, being out in nature, our ski hill, right? These are all things that come up a lot in discussions of what there is to do leisure-wise in Los Alamos. So one thing that had kind of surprised me that came up again and again, especially from people living here in the 50s, was horseback riding. And so the stables, which are now located on North Mesa, used to be located in the western area above the Sandian Trinity Loop. And I was talking about this in preparation for this lecture. Was talking about this with some friends the other day, one of whom had moved here to Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project as a young girl. And she was telling us the story about how she and her friends would go horseback riding in Bandelier. And this picture is not of her, I don't believe, but actually is of girls horseback riding in Bandelier. And she said, you would go out to about where the ceremonial cave is, and then you would turn around, and horses would start to go really fast, because they wanted to get back to the stables, right? And she was saying one day they were riding along, and the horse started going faster and faster, and she notices the girl ahead of her, her saddle starts to slip. And it's coming back, and it's coming back, and it's coming back, and it's starting to slide off the rump of this horse. And this poor girl is holding on for dear life as this horse is trotting down as fast as it can go down the trail in Bandelier, with this poor kid riding on the back of this saddle that is sliding lower and lower off the horse's rump. And luckily she made it back before anything disastrous happened, before the saddle went all the way off. But so these are some of these stories that keep coming up. And people will relate these beautiful memories of different events that happened here that are both beautifully mundane, but so quintessential to the fabric of what Los Alamos is as a community. Other people talk about this idea of making one's own fun, right? That you had to find a way to entertain yourself in Los Alamos. So for some people, that was getting your friends together and playing bridge. For some people, that was dinner parties. It's also been cited as the reason for the baby boom in Los Alamos, both during the Manhattan Project and during the Cold War era. And then one guy who was interviewed grew up here. He moved here as a baby in the 1940s. Said he and his friends used to go down to the dump and throw Molotov cocktails and set off pipe bombs. Which reminded me of people I knew in high school. So, things haven't changed that much. Another issue that sort of keeps coming up about Los Alamos history is the history of the business community in Los Alamos. And without a business community, we would not be a town, right? But it's also come up that Los Alamos is not an easy place to have a business. And here are some numbers from the document I was mentioning earlier, Notes on Los Alamos in 1954, about different businesses that we had in Los Alamos at that time. So we had 2 movie theaters, which was really surprising for me, who grew up and left, I think, the year that the movie theater closed down, for those of you who remember that period. But there are, the small business scene in Los Alamos has always been small but vibrant, right? And if those of you who are on Facebook, for instance, every once in a while you get this delightful thread that will come out in one of the discussion boards about, oh, what business used to be there, right? And so there was one about Starbucks, right? And so someone was like, well, you know, it used to be a drugstore. And someone was like, well, no, before that it was TGNY was over there. And someone else was like, no, TGNY was over in Merrimack. And they were like, no, you're talking about the new TGNY, the old TGNY. And so there's always been this sort of coming in and coming out of different businesses in Los Alamos that have really left a mark on the landscape of Los Alamos, if you will. So I wanted to close with this slide. So as you can see from this picture, this is Ashley Pond in 1957. As you can see from this picture, a lot has changed in Los Alamos over the years. Although there has been continuity in many respects. Narratives of safety and isolation have remained stable. The town in many ways has remained a company town, but what exactly that means has changed over time. While some have seen the commitment to science, technology, and knowledge as a consistent thread, others have felt that these values have been eroded and replaced with an ethos of consumerism, both in terms of increased displays of wealth made possible by private land ownership, and in terms of the science conducted in Los Alamos, as the lab has continually shifted its focus and justification for existence. One last story. Note the fence around Ashley Pond. So I don't know how well you can see it, but you can see this kind of fence stretching around the pond. Apparently that was erected because somebody actually did drown in Ashley Pond in a canoe accident. And this was kind of I think the most surprising thing that I stumbled across, because when I grew up, Ashley Pond was about 2 feet deep and mostly just kind of muck. And this idea that it was, an actual lake once, or lake by New Mexico standards, right? And that, people engaged in sports on Ashley Pond, and that it had proven fatal. I cannot for the life of me remember where I read this. So if anybody has more information on this story, please let me know. This kind of concludes my portion of the storytelling aspect of this talk. If you would like to be interviewed as part of this project, please fill out the note card, either one on your seat or one of the ones in back. Please note that we do not guarantee that everyone will be interviewed or that the results of the interviews will be represented in the museum exhibit. However, all offers of participation help the project. So And interviews generally last around an hour, and please be able to commit to a 2-hour block of time to account for equipment setup, tear down, etc. But we can also conduct multiple interviews, or interviews in multiple sessions if necessary. So if you can't commit to that block of time, we can make things shorter. Right? Here are the instructions for the note card. If you would please list your name, your contact information. Email is preferred, but phone or mailing address is also acceptable. The year you were born, the years you lived in Los Alamos. You do not have to be a current resident. Actually, technically, you don't have to have been a resident at all, but if you have some connection to Los Alamos, please do indicate when that was. And then topics you would like the interview to focus on. I don't want to get into an interview, spend 40 minutes talking about one thing, and then in the last 5 minutes of the interview, realize that there was something really important that we should have been talking about this entire time, right? So either things that you personally think are important for us as a historical society to know, or just important moments in your life that you would like to reflect on. So if you want to get in touch with me, so I ask that you leave the note cards in one of the baskets provided in the back. But if at some later date you want to get in touch with me, my email is srbuelow, that's B-U-E-L-O-W, @iu.edu. And the Los Alamos Historical Society can be reached through their website at losalamoshistory.org.
So we do have some time for questions. Whoops, I'm sorry. I was not supposed to do that. Let's try it that way. There we go. I have time for questions. So do we have questions for Sandra? All right, real quickly, keep thinking of your questions. The story about the drowning on Ashley Pond is in the book Inside Box 1663. And so that's where you read that. And it was during the Manhattan Project. They took some canoes from the ranch school. One of the boys fell out and drowned. The other thing I can real quickly announce, because I forgot to do this when I was talking about upcoming events, this Saturday is Sig Heckler's annual lecture at the LDS Church. It'll be Saturday at 7 p.m. He's going to be talking about nuclear hotspots in 2019, so we hope to see you there. Now, questions? I know you have some.
It's more of a comment. My experience at the Hans Beta House is people ask, are there still activities going on at the Los Alamos laboratory, rather than is there a town? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so I've gotten both sets of questions. There's a lab here but no town, and there's a town here but no lab, right? People are always very interested in who's working there, how many people, what are they actually involved in. They're obviously no longer designing the original atomic bombs, so what keeps people employed, right? So no, that's yeah, I've definitely encountered both sides of this, and so I'll always talk a little bit about that there's space exploration research going on, that there's medical research going on, that there's computer and information research going on, right? That we have diversified what we do. Yeah, that's an excellent point, that there isn't just the surprise that Los Alamos has a community around it, but also the idea that it's still an operational and functioning laboratory. Thanks.
As a boy growing up in Los Alamos during the 50s, I wish I had known that you had to get Zia's permission to mow your lawn. Because I would have used that, and that wasn't my experience.
Yeah, I was reading that actually today on an article about the Zia company, and did get the impression that there were probably a lot of people who flouted that law, much to the chagrin of their children.
You can also get your house painted by Zia, and I understand you can get your light bulbs changed.
we moved to western area in 1948. It was barren with the seeds just planted, no information to us that we could not do anything. They told us that it was up to us to plant whatever we wanted. That's what we were.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, and I have heard people talk about this idea of the barren landscape, right? That there are, I mean, if you drive around the western area today, there are all these beautiful established trees, right? So I grew up in a house on 41st Street, and I think we had 4 ornamental crabapple trees in the front, a Russian olive, 2 apples, and a little stick of a peach tree that produced 1 peach every other year, growing it back. So it's really amazing to see what the fruits, literal and figurative fruits of the labor of love that was put into a lot of those properties back when they were first developed.
Now, since you're looking into the Cold War, did you uncover much on civil defense activities in the town?
There was a little bit of research that was done on this. I haven't looked deeply into it myself. Again, sort of with this continuation of narratives, one thing that did come up in our research and that came up actually one day while I was working in the Beta House was that there was a Girl Scout troop who got to be the guinea pigs for the civil defense shelters, right? And that they were told that they were going on a camping trip and that they should bring lots of board games, but they were not told where they were going. And they get to the fire station and we're told, okay, we're all going into the fallout shelter and you're going to spend the weekend in there. And so there was we found a newspaper article on this, but then also a woman who had come through the Beta House was talking about this, and she said, yeah, it was the most boring Girl Scout event that we ever did, and nobody wanted to use the box toilet. And those were her 2 great memories of this experience. But I did also find reference to town-wide evacuations in test drills that have been done, and that those have gone very, very orderly, which was something that happened again in 2000, right, when the town was evacuated. That again ended up being a very orderly procedure. And then in the Beta House we have some lovely little artifacts, right? We have a home radiation kit, so you can test your family for radiation and your house, and a can of water and some other civil defense. But yeah, it had been talked about sort of both in this terms of Los Alamos as a model community for civil defense, and then also other people were saying that there was surprisingly little civil defense training going on here in spite of everything.
I have a large collection of civil defense assignment cards. How many of you all have those? Other questions? All right, well, Samuel, thank you again. Really